Throughout this video, I'll be talking about borderline personality disorder neuropathology. What is borderline personality disorder? BPD is a serious mental illness characterized by insidious patterns of instability in mood regulation, impulse control, interpersonal relationships, and self-image. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is the handbook used as the authoritative guide to the diagnosis of mental health disorders. It states that to be diagnosed with BPD, at least 5 out of the 9 specific criteria be met. This includes panicked efforts to avoid abandonment, patterns of unsteady and intense interpersonal relationships that alternate between extremes of idealization and devaluation, poor and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self, impulsive behaviors in at least 2 potentially harmful areas like sex, substance abuse, binge eating, reckless driving, and spending, recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures, and threats, or self-mutilating behavior, extreme mood shifts usually lasting a few hours, chronic feeling of emptiness, inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger, and severe dissociative symptoms, stress-related paranoid ideation, and feeling cut off from oneself or reality. The causes of borderline personality disorder are not fully understood, but scientists agree that it is the result of a combination of environmental and biological factors. Environmental factors include physical, emotional, and/or sexual abuse, emotional or physical neglect, and parental insensitivity and/or abandonment. Biological factors include genetics and abnormalities in brain structure and function. The main brain regions affected by borderline personality disorder are in the areas that control impulses and emotional regulation, such as the hippocampus, the amygdala, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The 2 brain regions most consistently found to lead to alterations in BPD patients are the hippocampus and the amygdala. The hippocampus plays an important role in memory consolidation and declarative memory, whereas the amygdala is the integrative center for emotions, emotional behavior, and motivation. Volumetric magnetic resonance imaging results from 11 studies comprising 205 BPD patients and 222 healthy controls were quantitatively synthesized by Ruocco and colleagues in 2012, using meta-analytic techniques in order to determine the magnitude and effects of hippocampal and amygdala volumes. Patients showed an average of 11% and 13% decreases in the size of the hippocampus and the amygdala, respectively. Reductions in hippocampal volume may lead to neurocognitive deficits, dissociative symptoms, perceptual distortions, and identity instability seen in BPD patients, whereas the amygdala plays a crucial role in regulating emotions such as anger and fear, as well as in the controlling of aggression and stress responses. It could also be involved in stress-related dissociation seen in a high percentage of individuals with BPD. Many neuroimaging studies of BPD have focused on abnormalities in the anterior cingulate cortex. Many volumetric studies have shown bilateral gray matter reductions in the ACC in patients with BPD. In a PET study using phenfluramine challenge, impulsive aggressive patients with BPD showed significantly less activity in the cingulate cortex, which is shown to indicate impairments in emotion regulation. A study by Horst and colleagues using magnetic resonance spectroscopy, which is a non-invasive technique that can be used to measure the concentrations of different chemical components within tissue, shows that BPD is associated with higher levels of glutamate in the ACC, and there are positive correlations between glutamate levels and self-reported measures of impulsivity and subscores of the borderline personality disorder symptom list. In sum, the ACC is involved in both cognitive and affective functions, and the deficits previously mentioned can be associated with BPD-related symptoms, including impulsivity, cognitive distortions, and affective instability. Although there is a large number of brain region deficits that may lead to BPD, the last one I'll be talking about in today's video is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Diminished dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity may have an effect on the emotional instability and impulsivity, attention, problem-solving, and memory seen in BPD patients. Even less activity in this brain region is present during the processing of negative emotional stimuli. A pilot study in patients with BPD and no comorbid psychiatric illness used proton magnetic resonance spectroscopy in order to measure neuronal function. They found that N-acetyl aspartate concentration, also known as NAA, in the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex was diminished. Compared to controls, patients with BPD showed a significant reduction of approximately 19% in the absolute NAA concentration in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and these reductions were related to deficits in memory and problem solving, as well as emotional instability and impulsivity seen in BPD patients. This article on the executive functions in borderline personality disorder by Hagenhoff and colleagues clearly shows the presence of deficits in 3 of the brain regions previously mentioned and how they all tie together. In the study, patients were compared to non-patient controls on 8 tasks, including the NBAC task and the go-no-go task. The NBAC task was used to measure working memory functions. Subjects were asked to compare the currently presented stimulus with the one presented either 1 or 2 trials back, and determine whether they are the same or different. In the go-no-go task, subjects were asked to react to one stimulus type with an overt motor response, called the go trial, and to withhold an overt reaction to the other, which was referred to as a no-go trial. This was used to assess inhibition processes. In both these executive function tasks, BPD subjects showed a hypoactivation of frontal regions, including the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, and hyperactivation of the amygdala. The results from the 8 tasks showed that borderline personality disorder patients presented deficits in all executive function domains. Next, I'll be discussing functional connectivity in borderline personality disorder patients. A study by Peer and colleagues suggests that deficits in frontal-limbic connections relate to the severity of BPD symptoms such as affective instability, abandonment avoidance, and anger. The 3 main networks in BPD are the following. First, the default mode network, which is a network activated when the brain is at rest in the absence of goal-directed activity. It is influenced by the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex and is responsible for self-referent thinking. The salience network, which includes the orbital frontal insula and the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, and the medial temporal lobe network, which is responsible for processing negative emotions. There are alterations in the connections between these 3 networks with particularly problematic connectivity between salience detection and self-referential encoding. This results in misidentification with neutral stimuli, as well as a failure to integrate salience information with internal representations. This explains many symptoms seen in borderline personality patients, such as inappropriate intense anger. In addition, mapping these networks on fMRI shows increased connectivity between the amygdala and the ACC. Lastly, I'll be discussing the findings of an article in relation to the brain abnormalities involved in abandonment avoidance seen in borderline personality disorder patients. In this study, Brioco and colleagues used functional near-infrared spectroscopy, also known as FNIRS, to examine prefrontal cortex function using a social interpersonal paradigm. FNIRS allows functional imaging of brain activity through monitoring of blood oxygenation and blood volume in the prefrontal cortex. It does so by measuring changes in the concentration of oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin. This experiment starts with the subject seated at a table with 2 Confederates, with a standard deck of 52 playing cards placed face down at the center of the table. The subject was selected to begin the game and told to place 1 card face down in front of any one player of their choice. The rule was that only the player who had just received a card could take the next card and place it face down in front of another player. No one could give the card to themselves. Subjects were told that the player who received the card with the Queen of Hearts would receive a small token. During the first scan, known as the inclusion condition, subjects were fully included in the social interaction with the other 2 players. In the second scan, known as the exclusion condition, the subjects received 7 cards from the Confederates, and the subject was then completely excluded from the social interaction when the Confederates stopped placing cards in front of them for the remainder of the scan. Data from the final 30 seconds of the exclusion condition were used for the FNIRS analysis. Following each scan, subjects provided ratings of their feeling of inclusiveness and rejection during the previous scan. Initially and after each scan, subjects rated their current levels of anxiety and depression. Correlation analysis revealed that evoked oxygenation in the medial prefrontal cortex during the exclusion condition was associated with clinical ratings of BPD-related rejection and abandonment fears. In summary, borderline personality disorder is a serious, long-lasting, and complex mental health problem. It affects how you feel about yourself, how you relate to others, and how you behave. As with other mental health disorders, the causes of borderline personality disorder are not fully understood, but researchers do believe that it is caused by a combination of factors. In the past, BPD was seriously misunderstood, but the disorder is now being better recognized and diagnosed, and more communities have established specialized treatment programs that significantly improve outcomes for people with BPD. Further research is needed, though, to better understand all the causes and symptoms related to this disorder.